The big question of the last 18 months is how has cloud changed how this pandemic has functioned? How has the pandemic changed us and how has cloud enabled that?
So it's a great question because we've seen a huge uptake in cloud. And I'll talk a little bit about the numbers, but the pandemic has changed how we work. It's changed how we interact. Changed how we learn. It's changed so much of our lives, and the cloud is allowing companies to adapt to that change more quickly. In a recent survey we did of global executives, uh, the increase in digital interactions that companies had with their customers that increased dramatically. It went from 40 to 65% of their interactions on average were digital. Most companies were getting close to 80% of their interactions were digital. Companies started to invest much more heavily in technology as part of the underneath with the pandemic, in the face of the pandemic. We saw in it most companies reporting that they are 7 years ahead of where they thought they would be prior to the pandemic. And finally, the big number, many companies reported, or on average reported, that they were moving, believe it or not, 24 times faster to the cloud than they thought. This was all driven by the need to change rapidly in the face of the pandemic, how we interact with our customers, how we interact with suppliers, and frankly, how we interact internally in our companies. The cloud enabled a lot of that, and it went from being something that companies were doing, but at a slow pace, to something they're now doing very rapidly.
Just to help people understand this, a counterfactual, if this pandemic had happened 10 or 15 years ago before this real move to large scale cloud computing, what would work in life have looked like under those circumstances compared to what actually happened?
I think it would have been a lot more challenging. I think, for instance, we would not be communicating in the virtual world the way we are. The virtual meetings would not be at the pace and scale that they are. Many of us would be dealing with the dangers of the pandemic. Many more of us would be, meeting in person. We would be going about our normal lives. I think we would not be, buying online like we are. And then companies would not be able to respond with the speed and effectiveness they did. You take a company like UPS, who optimizes 20 million deliveries a day in the cloud. They would not have been able to do that. They would not have been able to deal with the dramatic increase in demand that we saw during the pandemic. So you'd have seen breakdowns in the supply chain. And obviously, we're having supply chain challenges today, given the pandemic, but they would be far greater. So I think it's the cloud is kind of this invisible capability in the background that's actually allowed us to deal with the pandemic in a way that I think you're right. The thought experiment going back 15 years, it's almost hard to imagine how we would have gotten through it the way we have. And frankly, while it's been challenging for everybody, in some ways, businesses have been remarkably resilient in terms of how they have dealt with the pandemic. And I think a lot of it, not a lot of it, but some of it and much of it is due to the enablement that the clouds provided them.